QSO Today, episode 384, Geoffrey Mendenhall, W8GNM. My thanks to Icom America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. This podcast is not only supported by Icom, but by your generous contributions, subscriptions, coffees, and Amazon purchases. While I don't mention names on the podcast to keep it on topic, I'm extremely grateful. Your generosity has made it possible to produce the podcast every week, approaching 400 episodes of QSO Today, and to invent the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo 2 years ago. Instead, I had my programmer build a list on my sponsor's website page of all of your subscriptions and contributions, ranked in order by the amount total over time, where you have given me permission to publish this fact. We are still trying to figure out how to include the Buy Me a Coffee donations as well. Beginning this week, I will include this list on the show notes page every week. I value your feedback on how to handle this recognition. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates, through in-depth interviews, just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is returning on May 12th, Greenwich time, with new presentations and some very interesting ways to meet in virtual person integrated into our VFairs platform. Please stay tuned for announcements on the Expo website. Links in the show notes pages. In addition, my team has created some very novel ways for your club or organization to participate in the Expo, to meet old friends, and to make new ones. The pandemic has demonstrated to us that your club does not have to be defined by its locality. Contact me if you'd like more information. Geoffrey Mendenhall, W8GNM's early interest in electronics, germanium transistors, and later high-power triodes led him to a career as an engineer, designing, building, and managing broadcast transmitter projects for Gates Radio and later Harris. Geoff made a presentation in the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo on beverage antennas, urging us to try building beverages even if conditions are not optimal, and being surprised by the result. W8GNM is my QSO Today. W8GNM, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Geoff?
QSL, I'm here, alive and well and ready to talk.
Geoff, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it started actually a little bit before I got licensed as a ham. I built my first 7-in-1 electronics kit from Olson Radio when I was about 8 years old. It had a single 6SN7 dual triode in it, and that kind of got me really interested in electronics. And, of course, one of my favorite projects was a phono oscillator transmitter that I could transmit on the broadcast band to my neighbors with. And then in a few years later, I got my Novice license in October 1961 when I was 14 years old. That's about almost 61 years ago.
What happened between those years? Were you building kits? Or you just had one kit? Were you building Heath kits? Did you have any encouragement from your friends and family to be involved in electronics?
Oh, sure. Yes, from my first 7-in-1 electronic kit till when I got my ham license and built my first ham rig. I built a lot of homebrew things, mainly not kits. I had, some of the older hams may recall the Raytheon CK722 germanium transistors that first became available to hobbyists. And so I had all of the Raytheon application books and then came up with some things of my own. So I built all sorts of projects, not only radio projects, but photo detector projects and code practice oscillators and other kinds of things with the very early Raytheon germanium transistors.
What was the source of those transistors at the time? A neighborhood electronics store would have those, or surplus outlets?
Well, I lived in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and we had a radio parts store that carried replacement parts for television sets, primarily TV repair shops purchased their parts there, and they had some things for experimenters. They had a few ham radio things, and I used to hang out at a TV repair shop with a guy named Paul Berkey and another guy who became an Elmer when I was a ham, Clyde May. They both had TV repair businesses, and so I learned more about electronics there, and ultimately got parts to build my first ham radio transmitter from the TV repair shops.
So at age 14, when you got your first license, that was your novice license?
Yes. Yeah, I was first licensed as KN3VLN. Victor Loves Nancy.
I believe in those days that novice license was only good for a year?
Yes, that's correct.
And so you upgraded that year?
Yes. Yeah, within 6 months, I upgraded to technician. And then, a year or two later, I upgraded to general.
And your call sign changed to?
K3VLN. Yeah, Kilo 3 Victor London Nancy.
Okay, so you're a technician at age 15, 16. What did you do? How did you get on the air as a technician class licensee?
Well, let's see. As I said, my first rig was a CW rig only. It was an 807 driven by a 6AG7, one of those kind of standard rigs. And then later I got I did build a night kit T150 that had a pair of 6146s in it. And it would operate on 6 meters. I built my own 6-meter beam antenna. And that was still in the days of AM and getting into sideband. As a matter of fact, later I didn't have enough budget to buy a sideband rig, but I actually converted the night kit T150 to a double sideband suppressed carrier transmitter, which was kind of like fake sidebands. Everybody listening on upper or lower sideband thought I was single sideband, but I was actually double sideband.
In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the school that you went to, did you go to public school or did you go to private school? And did they have an electronics program?
I went to public school. No, they did not have an electronics program. They had a pretty good sciences program in math and chemistry and physics. And of course, they had industrial arts. Some of my favorite classes were shop. So I took wood shop and metal shop and learned how to build things with my hands. I did have a science teacher who got us very active in science fairs, local and regional, and actually went on to a national science fair. And we also had a person from management at one of the technology companies in town who sponsored a junior engineering and technical society group in Johnstown. And so I was very active in science fairs. I built a number of different things. I remember building a radio-controlled bus from scratch, built all the radios and everything in it. But the kind of my crowning achievement in the science fair arena was a 6-meter linear amplifier that I built. It used a single 4-400A tube, but it was in a kind of a unique operating mode. It had active screen voltage. It was a grounded grid amplifier, but it had a lot more gain than a typical triode amplifier. And one of my Elmers, Bill Orr, W6SAI, who was an executive with IMAC, gave me my first 4-400A for the science fair, and he was very encouraging, helped me a lot. And actually, I wound up going to New York City to the National Jet Science Fair with that project.
And how did you know Bill Orr?
Just, through ham radio. I first time I contacted him, I don't think I'd even worked him at that time, but I just wrote him a nice letter, said I was a high school student working on a science fair project. Did they have any reject 4-400s that I could buy at a discount? And I told him about my proposal to build this 6-meter linear amplifier. He was very nice. He wrote me a nice letter back and sent me a brand new tube. It was not a reject. And what was interesting is, as you'll hear later in my career, I wound up eventually buying millions of dollars of tubes from Bill Orr and IMAC when I was executive at Harris Corporation. We were buying large tubes for broadcast transmit.
Well, it pays to be generous to kids then.
Yes, it does. Yeah, his generosity paid off.
They'll remember.
Yes, and I used to meet him face to face many, many times over the years at the National Association of Broadcasters show, and out at the iMac factory in California. I visited there several times as well.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Well, as a matter of fact, ham radio did have a big impact on my selection of school. I did want to study electrical engineering, and I considered a number of different schools, including Penn State, which was in Pennsylvania, not far away, and Carnegie Tech. It was Carnegie Mellon at that time. But had a couple of ham buddies who were a year or two older than me that went to Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and they just raved about Georgia Tech. And so I put that on my list and got my parents to take me down there and look at it. And it was very attractive to me because it was a little further from home. It's that age when you want to put a little distance between you and your parents. And it was a school that combined a very good education in engineering theory, but also a lot of practical hands-on things. And so I did select Georgia Tech, and I worked out sort of my own co-op program. I worked my way through school, primarily working at WAGA TV, which was the Store Broadcasting and CBS affiliate. It was the Southern news gathering newsroom for CBS News. And that led to a lot of interesting work as a cameraman and a technician for WAGA. But I did attend Georgia Tech from 1965 and graduated in 1970 with an electrical engineering degree.
And was that a BSCE, or did you go on for the master's there?
No, I did not do a master's there. Actually, at Georgia Tech, it was called a BEE, a Bachelor of Electrical Engineering. I don't know why the S was missing, but anyway, it was a BEE from Georgia Tech.
Did you work at WAGA TV as an intern or a student at the same time that you were going to school?
I worked as a part-time student technician while I was in school. So, of course, I didn't attend school all year round. It was on a quarter system, so I was usually off in the summer. So I worked pretty much full-time for WAGA in the summer, but I worked nights and weekends for them while I was in school. And that was quite an interesting job because I not only worked as a cameraman and met some very interesting people, including two presidents along the way, but it was also very educational because that particular station designed and built a lot of their own equipment. So when we were not actually working as cameramen or working as video or audio operators, we were back in the shop building equipment from scratch. They had a brilliant chief engineer who designed and had us build a lot of equipment, including video distribution amplifiers, video switchers, audio switchers, and so on.
Why was that cheaper than, say, going to any of the companies that were making equipment in those days, RCA, places like that?
Well, they weren't really. They had co-op programs, but getting a job with one of those companies would probably be an alternate quarter thing. So it wouldn't fit the schedule as well as what I did. I went to school 3 quarters and I worked 1 quarter in summers. And I had a particular interest in broadcast.
Why did this chief engineer at WAGA think that building the stuff in-house was more cost-effective than buying it from out-of-house, unless the labor was really cheap?
Well, I think, I think it was a combination of things. We were there anyway as technicians, so in our downtime, they got some productivity out of us. But more importantly, the engineer that designed this equipment really had futuristic vision, and we were building things that you could not buy on the market. For instance, the audio mixing equipment and switching equipment at that station was all remote. The control surfaces that the operators used were remote from the actual racks where the audio mixing and amplification and distribution was done. So there were features in the equipment that we built that really weren't available commercially at that time.
So things like, AC hum, all these issues that you might have with lots of cables going in and out of the control surface were eliminated by remotely controlling it, keeping them short, keeping them in the cabinet.
Yes, exactly. And it was kind of the precursor to where we are today. Today, almost all the audio and video in any broadcast facility is all transported over Internet protocol now. So there's hardly any analog audio or analog video running around. But in those days, it was still analog, but it was analog that could be carefully controlled and contained in one area.
And now this message from Icom America. Now, after you've cleaned up your holiday decorations, admired the colorful socks and ties from your well-meaning significant others, it's time to get what you really wanted on your holiday wish list. Spice up your ham shack with Icom's new ID52A handheld radio, now shipping. This radio is perfect for staying in or venturing out and working your favorite VHF and UHF channels this winter season. The Icom ID52A is Icom's newest handheld amateur radio that is VHF and UHF dual band with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star, simplex, repeater mode, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and the ability to send photos over D-Star with a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode. Integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square locations, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it's IPX7 waterproof. Can you believe it? For more information, please click on the Icom banner ad in this week's show notes page at QSOtoday.com. So get that new radio that was missed on your list. And when you purchase your new Icom ID52A or any other amazing Icom radio or accessory, please tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, it's my understanding from a little research that you actually created a FM broadcast transmitter while you were at Georgia Tech?
Yes, that's right. I was one of the founders of the Georgia Tech student FM station. The call letters are WREK, REC, to go with the Rambling Wreck mascot of Georgia Tech. And that station was first licensed in 1968 as a 10-watt station. We went on the air with a commercial educational package from Gates Radio and an antenna, a two-element FM antenna that was donated by WTOP in Washington. It was something that they had used in the past. But we were eager to get more coverage and more power than 10 watts. And again, had a very limited budget. We were totally funded by student activities fees, so we really didn't have any state money flowing into the station. And so I decided to build a 450 watt amplifier. Why that size? Well, I had a 4CX 300Y ceramic tetrode tube that was a pull from another station I worked for in Johnstown, WJAC TV. And they would periodically replace tubes in their TV transmitter before they failed. And so I had this free 4CX 300Y, and I thought, well, that'll be a good tube for about 450 watts. So I wound up designing and building a 450 watt transmitter using that tube and some surplus parts that we bought from a guy named Julian. Let's see, I'm trying to think what Julian's last name was, but he was an Eastern Airlines pilot who had a hobby electronics business on the side, and was in a suburban location near Atlanta. He had this warehouse that was full of all kinds of military surplus electronics. And we went there and we bought vacuum capacitors and a plate transformer and rectifiers and meters and filter chokes and you name it. And so we collected these surplus parts together and built this transmitter. I didn't even have a workbench. If you go look at the link to the WREK transmitter that's on my QRZ page for W8GNM, you'll find a link there, and it'll take you to the history of that transmitter. I literally built that thing with hacksaw and pliers and file and a nibbling tool.
On the floor, as I recall. I found the article. Yeah, you were building it on the floor.
Yeah, building it on the floor, but that's what we did. So anyway, it actually worked quite well. We used that transmitter for, first of all, that transmitter combined with another cast-off antenna. We wound up getting an 8-bay FM antenna from WKLS FM. It had been hit by lightning and replaced, and we rebuilt that antenna, retuned it to 91.1, which was WREK's frequency, and that antenna had more power gain than the 2-element, the original Andrew antenna. So with a combination of the 450-watt amplifier and the 8-bay antenna got us to 3.2 kilowatts effective radiated power and greatly expanded our signal. By the way, WREK is still on the air today. I just a couple years ago attended the 50th reunion of WREK staff, and the station is currently 100,000 watts. Which is one of the very few student-owned and operated stations of that caliber in the country.
Well, it seems to me that you had this amazing confluence of Georgia Tech, WAGA, this opportunity with WREK that kind of maybe set the tone for your career.
Yes, it certainly did. And before we leave Georgia Tech, I want to also mention that I was active at W4AQL. They still have that call sign. They're the Georgia Tech amateur radio station. And I had a lot of fun making modifications, improvements to their old BC 610 transmitter. But yes, I decided that I wanted to go into some type of communications engineering, preferably broadcast engineering. But when I graduated in 1970, the broadcast equipment industry was in a bit of a slump. And I remember sending out resumes, and nobody was hiring in the broadcast realm. So I wound up going to work for Comco, which was a division of E.F. Johnson. Comco was located in Coral Gables, Florida. And so my first job out of Georgia Tech was designing aviation, land mobile, and marine communications for Comco, and that was in 1970.
If we're thinking back to those days, is there a specific radio that you have a fond remembrance of?
Well, we worked on a lot of different transceivers. One that was particularly interesting was a receiver for the aviation band for ground-based communications to aircraft, and that receiver had very, very stringent intermodulation specifications. This was in the early days of MOS FETs, and I remember learning about dual gate MOSFETs, using them as highly linear antenna preamplifiers and mixers. So that was quite an interesting project to work on because we had to build some special test equipment to even measure the performance of the receivers. But another project we did at Comco, which was a lot of fun, was we were hired by national airlines to design their ground communications equipment between the what they call the tug, or the tractor that moves a 747, and the crew on the 747. This was, a new airplane at that time. National Airlines was based in Miami. So we designed this intercom system for the 747. And when they had their first inaugural flights of the 747, National Airlines threw a big party on a 747. They invited a lot of their suppliers, as well as travel agents and others, to this inaugural flight. So we all got on this 747 and took off and flew at relatively low altitude up and down the coast of Florida. And it was a big cocktail party. They actually had a baby grand piano up on the upper level of this 747 with the guy playing piano at the bar. So that was quite a memorable experience.
How did your career proceed after that?
Well, I still had broadcasting in my blood, and I was always thinking about, technology that I was working on at Comco or later at a company called Wackenhut Protective Systems. That was my second job in Florida, and we were doing electronic security systems. But as I was working on these things, I was always thinking about, boy, this would make a really good stereo generator, or, I was always thinking about applications for the technology that I was learning about in the broadcast realm. So in 1973, I decided I was going to take another shot at a job in the broadcast industry. So I sent out some resumes, and I wound up getting interviews from three companies. One was American Electronics Labs, AEL. They were in the Philadelphia area and built some broadcast equipment. RCA's, their broadcast division, which was in Meadowlands, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, and Gates Radio, which was then part of Harris Corporation in Quincy, Illinois. And so I did wind up getting interviews from all of those companies, but I was particularly impressed by the young group of engineers at Gates. In the end, I got an offer from RCA and from Gates, and the Gates offer wasn't as big as the offer from RCA, but I decided I wanted to go somewhere where I could learn more. And I took the job with Gates Radio and never regretted it, never looked back. The guy that hired me was a great mentor, and I was surrounded by people who were smarter than me and were eager to share and teach me.
Now, Gates Radio, I'm not a broadcaster or have any connections to broadcasting, but as I understand it, Gates Radio was a supplier to many radio stations, maybe even TV stations. Did they have TV transmitters too? Yes.
Gates Radio actually started out as an audio equipment company and formed by the Gates family. And Parker Gates, the son who carried on the business, moved into radio in the 40s. Post-war, they became a major supplier of AM and FM transmitters to radio stations all over the world. And then when Harris Intertype, at that time it was called Harris Intertype Corporation, acquired them in 1968, they moved into the television market. And they came up with a very innovative television transmitter. It was the first analog TV transmitter that used what's called IF modulation, and were quite successful with that. So the company then became a major supplier of both radio and television transmitting equipment, as well as studio equipment, to U.S. and overseas stations. They built shortwave transmitters up to several hundred kilowatts. And then later, a lot of innovations came from a guy named Hilmer Swanson, who was the inventor of basically all of the modern AM modulation techniques, things like pulse duration modulation, pulse step modulation, and eventually a complete digital modulation scheme called DX. And so I had the good fortune to work with Hilmer and worked as a design engineer, and then eventually ran the radio business unit. And then later, when we branched out into digital television, wound up being the vice president of engineering for all of the radio and television equipment development.
Let me ask, is Gates still around? Are they still making digital transmitters or transmitters?
Well, Gates Radio became the Harris Broadcast Division. And then in 2013, Harris Corporation decided to become a pure play defense electronics company. So they sold the Harris or Gates Broadcast Division to a venture capital company, and they went back to incorporate the name Gates in the name of the company. So it is now called Gates Air. So Gates Air is still based in Quincy, Illinois. Their engineering and senior management product development is in suburban Cincinnati, but their manufacturing is still in Quincy, and they're doing quite well. They've been one of the major suppliers for digital television transmitters during the Spectrum repack activities the last couple of years, where some TV broadcasters sold their Spectrum to the wireless providers, primarily T-Mobile, and many of those the transmitters that remained on the air had to be changed in frequency or replaced. And so that was a benefit to Gates Air.
And do you see, as a person that has now retired from the industry, but as still a consultant to the industry, do you see that over-the-air transmitters for broadcast will continue to be in demand? Or do you think that we'll kind of fold up the tent and send everything over the internet?
No, I think over-the-air broadcast is still quite viable for the long term, both in the U.S. and in Europe and other countries for a number of reasons. In the U.S., we're currently using what's called ATSC, Advanced Television Systems Committee, version 1, which is what's called an 8 VSB digital TV signal. It has a payload of about 19.8 megabits per second. But there is a new system that's been developed called ATSC 3.0. It's actually being tested on the air in a number of markets right now that has about double that capacity. Plus, it has a better modulation technique called OFDM that is particularly good for mobile reception. Why does this make broadcast viable? Well, first of all, it allows the broadcasters to provide mobile signals. If you think about IP or internet broadcasting, whether it's over wired link fiber or over the air with 4G, 5G, it's still somewhat limited to where the 5G footprint is. The broadcasters have, a huge stick. I call it the big stick with megawatts. So they have tremendous coverage over rural areas that would likely never be served well by a cellular approach to broadcasting. And when there's a major catastrophe, a storm, a hurricane, or something else, you'll find that most of the wireless systems and internet systems go down because they're networked in such a way that there's a lot of places where there can be a single point failure. They don't have adequate power backup. But most of the broadcasters have completely redundant sites, and they have their own backup generator power. So, when all else fails, people turn on their AM radio or their DTV, and that is an issue because there's not very many battery-powered DTVs around, but hopefully they can use their mobile phones to receive ATSC 3.0. There's also new business models for the TV broadcasters. Besides providing news and information, entertainment content, they can sell a part of their payload, their digital payload, for other applications,
like electronic signs or advertising or something like that.
Yes, it could be. It can be hyper location advertising down to one particular point in a city, or all kinds of other applications. So, and that's even true of some of the older technologies like HF shortwave broadcasting, which is largely faded. There's still some work going on with a digital system called DRM for HF broadcasting, but a lot of broadcasters, including our own VOA, U.S. Information Agency, have moved to internet distribution. But guess what? Depending on what happens with world events and politics, the internet can be shut down anywhere by any government at any time. And so, a lot of people think it's a good idea to have a direct over-the-air method to get news and information to people.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. So I'm hearing you talk, and I know that perhaps our generation, and maybe a generation before us, although certainly I can't think of my children's generation, actually own broadcast radios. So I guess I'm asking the question, do you see that perhaps smartphones might actually have the ability to receive these off-air signals, or are we creating these broadcast opportunities where the younger generation doesn't have the radios?
Well, as a matter of fact, many smartphones today do include chips for FM broadcast, but they're disabled by a lot of the wireless carriers because they don't contribute to the wireless carrier's revenue stream directly. So it's not a technological issue; it's a business model issue. So the answer is that mobile devices can receive radio and television. Especially, in the UHF frequency band, which is kind of like beachfront property spectrum-wise. That's why the wireless carriers were after some of that UHF spectrum. So there's no reason why broadcast services can't be carried and delivered by what we think of as a smartphone today.
So there is an opportunity for creating, you think about it, there seems to be no end to natural disasters around the world. In North America, it seems especially maybe because they have the largest news gathering to be able to report it, that all these infrastructures that we use for our smartphones are so fragile that when they're gone, we're kind of left holding a phone that doesn't work. So just knowing that perhaps it could be configured to receive an off-air signal or emergency signal or an update from the local broadcaster is actually kind of comforting.
You're absolutely right. So there's no reason that mobile device, as I said, many of them in the hands of people today can receive over-the-air broadcast radio and television. It's just a matter of a software switch being thrown in the phone. The hardware is already there. And so there are some broadcasters that are trying to find ways to have cooperative business models with the wireless carriers. I mean, a lot of these phones are supplied by wireless carriers, unless you buy an unlocked phone. But, a lot of them are you get them from whatever carrier, and they have their own software. And they have their own business model, so they exclude other things. We'll see how that evolves in time.
What's significant to you about WLW in Cincinnati, Ohio?
Well, WLW was a great technological achievement back in the 1930s. At one time, it was the most powerful AM broadcast station in the world. It was 500,000 watts. 500,000 watts, operated from north side of Cincinnati, near Mason, Ohio, and had a very unique state-of-the-art tower at that time. It was one of the early vertically polarized antenna systems, and it is a 750-foot roughly high antenna built by Blau-Knox in Pittsburgh at that era, and that was revolutionary at the time. I had the good fortune to live and work just a few miles from that tower. And so I had the opportunity to visit that transmitter site many times. And the old 500 kilowatt transmitter is still there in the building. It's no longer operational, but most of the parts are still there.
Now, were you active in amateur radio through this entire period of time of your career?
Yes, sometimes more active than others. When I was living in Florida working for Comco, I was apartment dweller, so I really didn't have an outdoor antenna. So I did a little bit of mobile amateur radio. So depending upon where I lived over my career and how busy I was raising a family, et cetera, that determined how much time I got to spend with amateur radio. But I did stay engaged over the years. I had my K3 VLN call until 1973 when I moved to Quincy, Illinois to go to work for Gates Radio. At that time, I got W9NEZ, and I had that call sign until 2000. After I moved to Cincinnati with Harris Gates, I got a W8 call. So my current call, W8GNM, I've had since 2000. And along the way, I also had an international call. I had a Caymanian call, ZF2CQ, which was a call sign I used when I was in the Cayman Islands. I'm also a scuba diver and underwater photographer, and my wife and I used to spend quite a bit of time in the Cayman Islands. And I would also operate amateur radio there, just throwing up a dipole in the palm trees and operating from the Cayman Islands as ZF2CQ.
What is your favorite operating mode when you were operating down there in the Cayman Islands?
Primarily single sideband. Did some CW, but I could generate bigger pileups on sideband, and I enjoyed being on the other side of those pileups.
Because you were a rare DX down there.
Well, rare to some people. Yeah.
How is the scuba diving in the Cayman Islands?
You know, it's great. I mean, at least it was. I haven't been there for a while. Well, all the coral reefs are under a lot of pressure right now with climate change and coral bleaching, that sort of thing. But there's still some very, very good diving there, and it's a great place for what we call wall diving, where you can, go over a vertical wall at 20 or 30 feet and look straight down 6,000 feet.
And float along the wall in the current.
Yeah, well, you if you have scuba on, you can go down over the wall, 100 feet or so safely. Or if you're snorkeling, you can just be on the surface looking over the edge.
I did that at Ras Mohammed in the Red Sea. It's exhilarating. I find floating in water at buoyancy 30 feet down to be kind of cool.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a place I'd like to go sometime. I know where you're talking about. I've seen a lot of underwater photos from there.
We can certainly talk about scuba diving and lose the rest of the audience. In my setting up this interview with you, I came across an article where you're standing with Art Collins, W0CXX, who was the founder of Collins Radio. I thought that was a really cool picture, but I also wanted to know, what was the circumstance that led you to be in Art's presence, and how did that go?
Well, at the time, I was working for another broadcast company. While I was in Quincy, I worked for Gates Radio for a number of years, and then I went to another company called Broadcast Electronics, which was founded by Larry Cervone. He was former general manager at Gates Harris, and we had developed a new 30 kilowatt FM transmitter that had a unique output stage. Configuration called a folded half-wave cavity. And I had known Warren Bruni, who was one of Art's close associates. Warren and I wrote one of the chapters for the National Association of Broadcasters Engineering Handbook together. And Warren and Art were quite interested in this folded half-wave cavity. So that photo was taken at the NAB show in Dallas, Texas, I believe. And that was taken at the Broadcast Electronics booth. And I gave Art a tour of that cavity and explained how it worked. And he was quite interested in how the whole thing worked.
Now, was Collins making broadcast radios or broadcast transmitters in those days?
Yes, they were. They had a division that made both AM and FM transmitters. And originally it started out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, but then it wound up in the Dallas area, and eventually was acquired by Continental Electronics, another company in the Dallas area.
What's the current rig?
Which current rig?
Before we turned off the video at the very beginning of our conversation on Zoom, which is what we're using now, I was actually looking at the array of equipment that was behind you. And so I guess those are the current rigs. But when I think of a rig, I think of the whole operating position, not just a single radio. So what are the radios that defined your current rig?
Well, my current ham radio station, the primary transceiver is a Flex 6600M. It's the Flex 6600M means it has a front panel. I still prefer radios with knobs on the front panel, although it can be operated with a computer-based GUI. So that's the main transceiver. I also recently got a Flex PGXL LDMOS legal limit amplifier. Only had that a short time. I have an amplifier that I built along the way and improved along the way over the years with bits and pieces from the broadcast industry. It uses a pair of 3500Z zero bias triodes, so it's a legal limit amplifier. And my previous solid state amplifier is a Tokyo High Power HL 1.5 KFX. I have a dedicated ham radio computer that I run Windows 10 on, and I have a display in front of me that I can do my logging with, and I can also use digital modes like FT8. The audio lineup in my station is my studio mic is a Heil PR40 microphone. I have a pair of Symmetrix 528E microphone preamplifiers. They also have noise gates and equalization capability, and I have one of those for the PR40, and I have one of them for my headset, which is a Heil ProSet Plus with a boom mic. And those feed into an Orban Optimod AM audio processor, which is a broadcast audio processor that I was fortunate to get in an employee sale of old show equipment. But it's quite an amazing device. And then that Optimod directly feeds the input of my Flex 6600M. And my backup radio is an Icom 756 Pro 2. And boy, I worked a lot of DX with that 756 Pro 2 as well. So that's pretty much the collection of equipment I have in the racks. I also have a Harris MS-15 FM exciter in the rack, which is not hooked up to anything right now. It's just kind of being stored there, but it's kind of a trophy. It's one of the FM exciters that I was involved in designing over the years, and this particular one spent 10 or 15 years at WREK in Atlanta before they upgraded to HD radio. So they gave their old exciter to me, and so I finally have one of the exciters I worked on in my rack.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. So, Geoff, I'm a little surprised that a guy like you wouldn't have a AM broadcast transmitter in the shack there to talk on AM, like on 80 meters or 160.
Well, I've thought about that over the years, and I've worked on some with some other friends. Be nice to have a Gates BC1T or something like that, but
the beautiful triodes in the window.
Yeah, the 833 is glowing or whatever. Yeah, I know. Well, those are neat to have, but there's space limitations. There's XYL limitations. Actually, we just finished our annual AM night on the Greater Cincinnati Amateur Radio Association's 1936 net. That was this past Thursday. It's the last Thursday in December. And we have a lot of heavy metal checking in there, a lot of broadcast rigs. But you know what? It's not as efficient, but I can generate just as beautiful an AM signal with a Flex 6600 driving a legal limit MOSFET amplifier. And the guy on the other end couldn't tell whether I was running a Gates or a Collins transmitter or a linear amplifier. Not as efficient, but you can generate excellent AM that way as well. So I don't get on AM much anymore.
So the combination of the PR40, the Optimod broadcast processor, and all that stuff going into the Flex 6600 makes you sound like your broadcast quality.
Absolutely. And, you can open up the bandwidth on the Flex to 10 kilohertz if you want to. We typically annoy people enough with 4 kilohertz, plus or minus 4 kilohertz bandwidth on AM. But yes, you can actually sound as good as a broadcast rig with a Flex, or for that matter, another software-defined radio like the Anon radios that are capable of going full bandwidth.
What's the current QTH?
My current QTH is, I live on an island off the north coast of Ohio, but it's an island you can drive to year-round, so you don't have to take a ferry to get here. It's called Catawba Island, which is the name of a grape that they grow around here, and it's the first island in an archipelago that extends north into the western basin of Lake Erie.
So you're surrounded by water. You're on an island. Do you operate Maritime Mobile?
Occasionally I do. I have a sailboat, and I have an Icom 706 that I can use in the car, and I have operated from my sailboat.
What do you load up the backstay?
No, I've tried that, but it's always difficult to get a good ground system that way. Actually, the best performance is to hoist a dipole like an inverted V up the mast. But I've also, on the higher bands, I've used a hamstick type antenna off the railing in the back, using the lifelines and the railing as counterpoint.
And that seems to work just fine while your wife takes the helm.
Yes, exactly.
Now, it's my understanding that your wife is also a ham.
She is. She's not real active now. We used to be very active as hams when we lived in Quincy, and before cell phones were popular. We had 2-meter rigs in our cars, and we had a local repeater. So we would keep track of each other on 2 meters that way.
You have a ham radio workbench?
I do.
What's the most interesting piece of test equipment that you have on your ham radio workbench?
Oh, boy. I have a lot of old HP boat anchors. I have a network analyzer and a spectrum analyzer. I have RF voltmeters. I have a couple of different scopes. I recently got a digital scope, the Handtech, amazing scope for $300. It's a 1 gigasample digital scope, and that's quite interesting. But I have some old Tektronix equipment as well.
You have the capability, even with all that old gear, to do some really serious testing. Now, you mentioned to me earlier that you were actually making an evaluation of the new Flex amplifier. What kind of evaluation are you making?
Oh, I'm kind of interested in the intermodulation performance of that amplifier, which should be better than the average MOSFET amplifier. Most of the solid-state amplifiers, their third order or fifth order IMD distortion isn't as good as a vacuum tube amplifier like a 3500Z or a 3CX1500 type amplifier. The MOSFETs are just not quite as linear, but the Flex amplifier has some interesting features. They have adaptive biasing of the FETs depending on the operating mode, and they have an interesting harmonic filtering system that actually splits off the harmonics into a resistive load rather than reflecting them back directly to the amplifier. So I'm kind of interested to see how much that improves the performance.
Are you a DX chaser or contester?
I participate in quite a few contests, just more or less to give points to other people. I'm not a guy that's really hardcore trying to win. A couple times I've had some pretty good scores that even surprised myself, but I'm there primarily to give points to other contesters that are really serious. I am a fairly serious DXer, and I have 9-band DXCC, so I'm at about 296 countries right now. Don't know if I'll ever get much past 300. The last 20 or 30 are really hard to get. But I did work the Monk SV2RSG/A on Mount Athos, which is a pretty difficult one to get. He's been on recently, so we keep working on it.
You were a presenter at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo last August, and you presented Compromised Beverage Antennas Hear Better Than You Think. It was a very interesting presentation that you made, and the Q&A that came afterwards was also very interesting, and that can still be viewed on our Vimeo channel. What is the current interest, the current amateur radio interest that you're doing?
Well, I'm still, very interested in design, computer modeling, and optimization and construction of amateur radio antennas. Those are still things you can get your hands around and work with compared to a lot of the surface mount stuff that's a little difficult to work with on the equipment. I'm still involved in further improving and supporting the BevFlex 4X antenna system that I developed a few years ago, which can be a beverage, bog, EWE, or a flag antenna. It's a low noise receive antenna. So I continue to do some work with W9XT on making further improvements to that and helping people who are working, building their first beverage or bog antenna and how to get it working and optimized. I'm very interested in SDR radio technology. So haven't built much of that from scratch, but very interested in learning about SDR and the applications of it. And as I said earlier, still interested in the design of RF power amplifiers and other homebrew projects. I recently built some antenna switching equipment, and I might add, I have both a nano VNA and a tiny SA, and those are two wonderful little pieces of test equipment that are very inexpensive that every ham should have. And I've been learning a lot using them instead of my big boat anchor equipment, and use a nano VNA a lot to measure and optimize antennas. For instance, my hex beam, I recently came up with a slight modification to the feed system on it, which has improved the SWR across all 6 bands.
So that sounds like that should be an article for a magazine, given the number of people that have hex beam antennas.
Yeah, I guess I could do that. I have a couple of articles and kind of I've kicked around, maybe submitting to QST.
Or it could even be another presentation at the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo.
Yeah, it could be.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Well, there's a couple that I can think of. First is getting the next generation of young people interested in amateur radio. It's like, why would we want to do amateur radio when we can get on the internet and text or FaceTime anywhere in the world? But there's a certain magic still, to me at least, in amateur radio as being able to send signals directly from one point on the earth to another without any intervening technologies or delays or censorship or anything like that. So I think the digital modes like FT8 and other digital modes can be attractive to younger people that are very interested in those technologies, and maybe makes amateur radio more relevant to them. There are some controversies about FT8. I think it's been a blessing for the low sunspot cycle, especially for people with limited antennas and limited power QRP. but it can be too automated and abused by those who are in search of a quick DXCC award. I hear of people running multiple, FT8 streams and trying to just, it's like drinking from a fire hose. How much DX can you work? In fact, I even run into some of those people who call me on FT8 when I'm calling somebody else, and I get around to finishing my QSO. I call them back; they're already gone somewhere else. There's a great migration away from single sideband and CW modes to digital modes. That has its good sides and its bad sides as well. Migration to digital modes has thinned out the opportunities on sideband and CW. But I think each of those modes has its place, and it will reach equilibrium at some point.
Do you have a sense how you might attract the next generation into ham radio? Have you thought about what tactical things we could do on the ground to actually create interest from that generation?
Well, I think getting involved with STEM programs at the high school level is a great way to get people interested. A lot of young people don't have any idea of that even ham radio exists, and when you talk to them about it or bring them over to your shack and show it to them, they sometimes get pretty excited about, wow, you can talk to somebody on the other side of the world from your, on a piece of wire in your backyard. That's pretty cool. So I think keeping it relevant. I think the opportunities to talk to the space station and astronauts. I mean, that opportunity's been around for a long time. I remember going to my daughter's grade school and getting them in contact with the space shuttle. And so that's a way to capture the imaginations of young people. And a lot of young people are interested in building things with computers, like the Arduino stuff, and tying that in with amateur radio is a good way to keep them interested.
Do you think that when you see a demonstration, for example, of talking to the space shuttle, that there's also a pitch for amateur radio and even maybe the local amateur radio club or something like that to students, or a follow-up activity that could kind of rope them in while it's still percolating in their brain? Does that happen?
I think so. I think, again, especially in high school, the STEM programs and, amateur radio offers a lot of opportunities for people to do science fair projects combined with a hobby. It's not as popular in high school as a lot of other activities, but I think that there's still a way to promote that.
Well, you're giving me an idea. It seems to me that local amateur radio clubs could kind of keep their eye out on what the science fair program is in their community and actually come up with perhaps even a resource list of potential science fair projects that would be new and different to many students.
Yes. Let's see. I'm trying to remember her name, but you will know. The young lady who did the Around the World Balloon Project. There's an example of someone who combined amateur radio with science, technology, and math, and put together a project where they flew a balloon that was designed to go to a particular altitude and not explode, come back down, and it made it all around the world several times, and they were able to track it via amateur radio and GPS reporting. So that was quite an accomplishment.
What excites you the most about amateur radio right now?
Well, I don't know. There's just one thing. On the one hand, I enjoy chasing after those last couple of countries to have them all for DX. Well, as I said, I already have 9-band DXCC, but there's still quite a few that I haven't worked. That's kind of exciting when one of them appears and I can chase after it. I have a couple of regular groups that I get together with to just rag chew. One of them is a group of broadcast engineers, and we get together once a week and have a good old time, and usually chat for an hour and a half. So I enjoy that. We have this 1936 net every Thursday night, 9 p.m. Everybody's welcome to check in around the country. And our annual AM night, that one night a year, the last Thursday in December, is a lot of fun with the AM rigs checking in. Yeah, I enjoy tinkering and building, measuring, and optimizing things.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams?
I think if somebody's returning to ham radio after leaving in the totally analog world, they ought to investigate some of the new operating modes, some of the digital modes, and learn about them.
Do you think ham radio clubs still play a part in welcoming new and returning hams back into the hobby? Or has it been replaced, do you think, by the internet and by Facebook groups and things like that?
Well, I think in some locations, the amateur radio clubs are quite active and do welcome and attract hams back into the hobby. Not so much in this area, but I'm in a little bit more of a remote area. Although I have reached out to a couple of the clubs, and I have gone out to see their field day operations and so forth. But back to your question about what do I recommend for somebody coming back into the hobby? Well, I think they need to investigate the newer operating modes. They certainly need to learn about software-defined radio technology. That's all new. And depending upon where they're living now, when they come back into the hobby, they may have some challenges in terms of how much space they have for antennas and things. Well, that can be a whole new thing to figure out. How can you build an efficient antenna in the space that you have? If you have a lot of space, you can have some really big projects, but even if you have limited space, you can try some new things. Antennas are always an important part of amateur radio, and it's probably one of the most important parts of the station.
I think that we forget that any kind of antenna is better than no antenna. And HOA perhaps can represent either a big downer for amateur radio, or your cup is half full and it's a big opportunity to figure out how to make it work and your neighbors not see it.
Well, I had a recent experience with a friend in an HOA situation that put a flagpole antenna in, and he was allowed to have a flagpole, and it looked like a flagpole. It was a flagpole. It just happened to be insulated from the ground, and we had quite an interesting time optimizing that, putting a remote antenna tuner in a weatherproof box hidden in the shrubbery at the bottom of the pole, and optimizing it and putting in the radials and hiding those. And so everybody was happy. Everybody thought he had a nice flagpole, and he worked a lot of DX with it.
I always think when people are doing this, especially, where there's like large grassy areas and no fences between properties in some of these places where someone does this, there doesn't seem to be any activity or questions during the construction.
Yeah, well, it depends on, if you're putting radials in, your neighbor might ask some questions. But if you put them in when your neighbor's not around, if it's a situation where it's seasonal and it's a summer home, or at least your neighbor's a summer home, you can generally get these things done without raising too many eyebrows.
Geoff, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. You have a very interesting history, and I think anybody that has an interest in broadcast will recognize all of the companies that you used to work for and made major contributions to. And I want to thank you again for sharing that story with me on QSO Today.
Okay, Eric. Well, it's been my pleasure to talk with you today. You're a very good interviewer, and glad to have the opportunity to tell a little bit of my story. And I hope to work some of your listeners on the air as well. So we'll be listening for them.
Thank you so much. 73,
Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Geoff. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W8GNM in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I am updating it as I have more information. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.